a statue, not a very good statue of him, but at least it's a reminder that Charles IV is still very, so it's still very much in people's minds. And you can see there that he was born the son of John of Luxembourg, the king who became the king of Bohemia. The kings of Bohemia could be elected, so they could elect anybody. Charles then is elected the king of the Romans, which is the first step towards becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. And he was born in Prague, so he was familiar with Prague. He was a great linguist. He spoke at least 6 languages fluently. And he had obviously an enormous attachment for Prague. So as the Holy Roman Emperor, although that was principally German, he could choose wherever his capital was. And he chose Prague. And he initiates what is now regarded as the Golden Age of Bohemia. He rebuilds St. Vitus, which we shall discuss now in detail. He founds the Charles University, which still survives today. And he starts the construction of the Charles Bridge, although, as you see there, it was originally called the Stone Bridge for obvious reasons. And he establishes what is the new town, which was a new development, as we shall see in a moment. He dies in Prague and then is buried in St. Vitus. So we'll discuss the cathedral itself. You can see it's a magnificent structure which was begun during the reign of Charles IV, and then is today surrounded by those almost Baroque-like looking buildings. They're not really terribly appealing from a distance anyway, but they are what is known as the castle district, or in fact they were the royal palace. They were the palace of the Habsburgs. So the cathedral, as you see it, is all of a piece, but in fact, as I mentioned yesterday, as you can see from the date, it took hundreds of years to be completed. And there you can see the nave as it is. You walk in, and I must admit, I didn't take this slide, I took it off the internet, and it is an impossible view to take today because there are more people crammed into St. Vitus Cathedral on a daily basis than you could possibly imagine. I don't know why this is going on and off, I'm sorry. So, as I mentioned, the far distant end, the east end of the cathedral, with that vaulting you can see in the sunlight, is the time of Charles IV. The columns of the nave coming towards. No, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going. Sorry? Is it my fault? Oh, I see. Okay, it is my fault. Right. You would learn something every day. And the columns coming towards you, as I say, are the 19th and 20th centuries. It is an incredibly important cathedral, and as I mentioned yesterday, and it does contain many monuments. We saw the stained glass window, which is by Mucha. But there is surviving in Prague this paper model. It's a very large model. It's not quite the size of this room, but it would be about a third of the size of this audience here. It's quite large. It was one man's sort of chef-d'oeuvre. It was one man's project, a man called Antonin Langweil. And it's made of sort of cardboard paper. And it is, of course, incredibly important because it dates a lot of buildings. It gives you an enormous amount of information what Prague looked like in the 1820s, 1830s. It's in the Prague City Museum, which is not difficult again to find. You can get there by metro. And it shows, as you see in the upper slide, the arrows point to the bell tower, which is visible in all 3 illustrations on the screen. And you can see that up until the 1850s was actually the end of the cathedral. And the rest of the cathedral is built thereafter in the 1850s into 1920s. And so the bottom right-hand slide shows the nave as it was built. But it looks so much all of a piece that one has to admire the architects of the time, the 19th century, who were responsible, because they could have made it a very different building, but they made it very much part of the original structure from Charles IV. So what you see in the model is the building as Charles IV would have known it, or saw it under construction during his reign. The actual top of the bell tower is later, but the bell tower itself was again part of the original construction. So it's one of these extraordinary long-term projects that is the end result is, of course, extraordinarily important. Now, the man who is so significant is the second man who works for Charles IV. The first, as I mentioned, came from France. He's known as Matthias of Arras, and the second man is Peter Parler, and he was obviously an incredible engineer, an amazing mason, basically. And what is significant is that in the cathedral, on the upper level, around the triforium of the chancel, you have a series of busts carved in the 1300s, including obviously Peter Parler himself, and I'll show you a bust of this series of Charles IV in a minute. So the chancel is built by Peter Parler, and he was of German-Czech descent, and he is acknowledged as the genius in creating this extraordinary structure. And it's unusual, as you know, for any cathedral in the Middle Ages to have a known figure, known as what we would call architect, a known mason at the time. So this again is a great plus in relation to St. Vitus. And he's also responsible for beginning the Charles Bridge as well, for which he deserves even greater credit, I think, or just as much credit. So he's an extraordinarily important man, Peter Parler. And in the cathedral, as I say, there's a bust of Charles IV. That is the lower right-hand illustration. He's looking rather benign, and I think he was, in real life, a short man, but he was an incredibly dynamic man, and he obviously had an enormous vision for Prague, which he institutes and which materializes, of course. So there you see him on the bottom right in the cathedral, part of this series of busts from the period of the 1340s. And then on the left-hand side, you can see him kneeling in adoration, a portrait of him in the Wenceslas Chapel that we saw yesterday. As you can see, he's on the lower level. The arrow points to where he's actually kneeling. And then if you go towards the center, if you go towards the right-hand side, there's a dark figure, which is the Virgin. Then there's a gap, which actually is the Christ on the cross. And then there's another figure going again further right, which is St. John the Baptist. So he's actually kneeling in adoration of the Virgin and St. John, who are witnessing the crucifixion. So both are obviously very relevant because they date the cathedral. They're significant in that he is shown as participating and organizing this extraordinary construction, and it acknowledges the role that he played. And there is, in addition, in what is the National Gallery of Prague. The National Gallery is a sort of second 11 museum, art gallery. I don't wish to be too rude about it, but it is a gallery which is not of the first order. It doesn't match up to the Louvre or the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and so on and so on and so forth. It has some nice things in it, and obviously some which are very, very relevant to Prague and its history, and this, of course, is one of them. It's a painting which was commissioned by the Archbishop following Charles IV, but still in the 14th century. And he is kneeling in the center at the bottom in the painting, and his name is Bishop Ochko. And he commissions this, and remaining with him for a moment, he's surrounded by the 4 patron saints of the Czech lands. Now, this is confusing, and I mentioned it yesterday, but St. Wenceslas is the patron saint of Bohemia. And Bohemia, as we know, is part of the Czech lands. So it means they're different saints. And they're fairly obscure. St. Procopius and St. Adalbert, they were both surrounding his statue we looked at yesterday. St. Vitus, of course, he's in red at the bottom of the illustration, holding his martyr's palm. And then the far right-hand side is St. Ludmilla, who is, of course, the grandmother, rather, of St. Wenceslas. But on the upper level is regarded as possibly the best recognizable portrait of Charles IV. He's there again kneeling in adoration before the Virgin and Child. He's being presented to the Virgin by his patron saint, who is St. Sigismund. And then on the other side of the Virgin, to the right-hand side of the Virgin, as you look at it, is Wenceslas IV, who's the son of Charles IV. And whereas Charles IV was a brilliant man, an incredible mover and shaker, he was incredibly dynamic, I'm afraid his son had none of those attributes at all, and was a bit of a flop. But anyway, there he is with his patron saint, who's St. Wenceslas. So a very important painting, amongst, as I say, with historic in value, but the National Museum Gallery of Prague, well, I'll show you where it is tomorrow, but it's in the castle district. But it's not, as I say, if you're visiting Prague for a couple of days, and there's so much more to see that you don't have to rush off to the National Museum. Now, whereas the cathedral took hundreds of years to be built, the castle that Charles builds, which is obviously outside Prague, named after him, Karlstein, it is built during his lifetime. I think he wanted this to be built as soon as possible because it was very, very symbolic of his position as the Holy Roman Emperor. And it was that tower you can see on the sort of left-hand side of the illustration. The tower looks a bit bleak. Well, castles are bleak, I suppose, but the tower looks a bit so grim. But it was, in fact, where the regalia of the Holy Roman Empire was housed. It was therefore very, very symbolic. It showed his power, it showed his position, it showed his significance in the whole of European affairs. And all these, the regalia which today is in Vienna, it still survives, was originally was housed during the reign of Charles IV here in this tower. Now, what is fascinating, and it is very, very popular today. It's a very very popular place to visit with masses and masses of tourists. But you can go on a visit. You can be taken on a conducted tour, which is probably the best thing to do. And what you see is this chapel. Now, this is particularly important because it's called the Chapel of the Holy Cross. Now, it's important for the fact that it survives as it was created. If Charles IV came back now, he would recognize it. There's nothing changed. It's one of these wonderful instances of, and again, this is so often happens in Prague, that because of the lack of destruction through the centuries, in general, this has survived. And it has been compared in date and in its significance to the Skroveni Chapel, which is the chapel painted by Giotto, and that's all documented in Padua, the Skroveni Chapel, which is this series of scenes from the Bible, which is all of a piece and is art historically terribly important, and also compared to some of the chapels in the Santa Croce in Florence, which again have enormous authenticity, painted by Cimabue and others. But this again is all of a piece. It is the Gothic vaulting, this rather strange sort of bauble decoration in the ceiling, and then the paintings in the background are all by one man. And it's obviously his life's work. It's obviously his chef-d'oeuvre. And it is by a man called Master Theodoric. And they're all painted by him. And they all stand, they all hang now, still in the same positions where they were put in the 1340s. It's one of these, as I say, miraculous pieces of art history that's it's so important because it survives intact, and long may it do so. Now, Master Theodoric is a rather shadowy figure. He's probably originally from Germany, but the German states, but he's registered by the 1340s. In the Prague Guild of Artists. So he obviously had come, well, obviously anybody who's ambitious and wishes to get patronage, the emperor is in Prague, so you come to Prague because you have the likelihood of being employed by him. And he is, as I say, the artist of all the paintings. They're very distinctive. They're quite small comparatively, and they all have this sort of imaginary painted frame within which the figure's rather squashed to make the figure look big. It looks as if they're sort of they're expanding over the framework. And you see that in quite a few of them, where the figure or some of the attributes of the figure expand. The one in the middle below, St. Jerome, you can see that his lectern is expanding across the picture frame. And it's a sort of bit of artistic license. The three on the top I'm particularly fond of. They're the three of the four evangelists. And St. Matthew, Mark, and St. Luke. And they each have their attributes. You see the left-hand side, the top left-hand side is St. Matthew with the angel, and the angel's whispering into his ear, you see. In the middle one, it's really my favorite of the lot. It's St. Mark, whose attribute, of course, is the lion, and you see the lion nuzzling up to him. It's so terribly sweet. And then similarly, the bull of St. Luke is having a good old conversation as well, telling them how to write the gospel, in fact. But it's got this wonderful naivety about it. They're sort of these bulky figures with these rather poppy eyes, and they're very, very distinctive. It's not, in fact, the greatest art in the world, but when you think it was from 1340, it's not too bad. And they just survive. They survive intact. And they're all still in the chapel. They haven't been moved. St. Catherine below with her wheel, of course, and her a sword. St. Jerome, who's one of the fathers of the Western Church, in the middle. And then rather sweetly down at the bottom right is a slightly more local saint, St. Elizabeth of Hungary, who was a charitable lady, and there she's feeding baked beans to somebody kneeling before her, feeding baked beans to the poor, which is rather sweet. They've got this lovely naivety about them. And another of the examples is St. Gregory. There you can see St. Gregory the Great, again, one of the forefathers of the church. He's writing his memoirs, or writing his thoughts and so on, and he's very sort of close, and he's expanding right across the picture plane, as you see. St. Gregory is a known figure, of course, and he was from Rome. He was a Roman, and he came from a patrician family. He became pope in 1590, dies in Rome, and is buried in the Basilica of St. Peter's. And it's after him that, after St. Gregory, that the Gregorian chant is named, although the Gregorian chant is much, much earlier, is much later than he, because Gregory is the 500-600s, the Gregorian chant is the 800s. But it is named after him, and I think this is rather a good excuse at this moment to play you, I think, a rather very, very beautiful singing of a Gregorian chant, if I can get it going. Wait a moment. Can't move the thing. There we are. So that's rather calming and beautiful, I think. And you can imagine that sort of music being played in the chapel I've just been showing you. In another chapel in the same castle is again a very significant, very fascinating painting. I think it's again, in my mind, unique because it shows the emperor again, Charles IV, who's holding a relic. He's holding the relic of the cross of Christ. It's made into a cross, but it's the pieces of wood which supposedly came from the cross of Christ. And it's being placed into the reliquary. And the reliquary is standing on the table, and with the exception of the base that you can see at the base of it here, with that exception, the cross survives today. And there you're looking at a painting of the 1340s, and you still see the same cross, which is now in the Schatzkammer, the treasury of Vienna. And that's really quite amazing. I cannot possibly think of another example that is so authentic, that gives you this incredible authenticity. And it's the imperial cross, which again, as I say, is part of the whole regalia of the Holy Roman Emperor. The item on the left-hand side of the cross in the illustration on the right is the lance of Saint Longinus, who stabbed Christ in the chest, as you know. So we'll move on. We'll go back to the Cathedral of St. Vitus in Prague, and you can see the east end of the chancel from the exterior, and the windows, which, as I mentioned yesterday, are all 20th century. They could possibly have been stained glass windows previously, but they were destroyed during the Hussite rebellion, which we shall discuss tomorrow. And there again, that's just a model. It's a paper model of the cathedral, showing, as I say, that if you did not know that it was built over centuries, you'd think it was probably built rather like Chartres within a lifetime, one man's lifetime. But it has this a very interesting history of its development. And in fact, the west doors that you enter through which you enter the cathedral, they're bronze doors. But of course, they're modern because they're 20th century, because they ended at the West End. So it's got a lot of treasures and a lot of variety and enormous amount of interest, St. Vitus. Now back to Prague, you can see the overall view of the city in the upper illustration, and you can see on the left-hand side St. Vitus Cathedral surrounded by the castle district, and that of course is on that promontory which is called Hradčany, the castle district. And then from there you descend through what is the lesser town. If you move from left to right on the upper slide, you descend through the lesser town and then cross the Charles Bridge, that you can see pointed out to you with the arrow, and then that Charles Bridge leads across to the old town. So the lesser town is where the various people associated with the power that resided in the castle. The lesser people would live in the lesser town. The craftsmen, the attendants, the whole entourage of the imperial court. So again, on the lower illustration, you see the Charles Bridge itself, which was begun, as I mentioned, in its present form by Peter Parler, the mason. And it is miraculous to think that floods of some considerable force. There was one recently, if you remember, I think it was about the 2003. There were terrible floods in Prague. And the bridge survived. And it has survived through many, many centuries with a great deal of wars and whatever, people rampaging across the bridge. But in the lower slide, you can see the cathedral in the middle, of course. On the left-hand side is St. Nicholas of the Lesser Town, which we shall discuss on Thursday. St. Nicholas of the Lesser Town is one of the great Baroque churches in the world. and then the Charles Bridge. And then, in fact, again, we shall discuss on Thursday the part of the whole castle district, which is on the far right-hand side, was a palace of the noble family called Lobkowitz. And we shall discuss that again on Thursday. So there is the Charles Bridge. Begun, as I say, in the 1340s. It was only called the Charles Bridge subsequently. It wasn't initially called the Charles Bridge itself, but it was a stone bridge originally. But there on the top left-hand side is the classic view where you see the bell tower and the dome of St. Nicholas framed by the two towers of the Charles Bridge. You can see it there. There's St. Nicholas of the lesser town, and then the two towers, with the cathedral, of course, in the distance. When I was staying in Prague this last year, I went on 2 or 3 occasions early in the morning, by which I mean about 7:38, with the sun shining, as you can see there, and that was the only time you could get the bridge, you could enjoy the bridge without literally shoulder-to-shoulder people. There were just hordes of people coming backwards and forwards across the bridge by 12 o'clock. So you could see it fairly early. But even at 8 o'clock in the morning, there were some worthy Japanese doing their tourist bit. So now, the two towers, you look there, the two towers of the Charles Bridge as it was entering the lesser town, there's a stumpy tower on the lower one, is in fact from the earlier bridge, because there would have been an earlier bridge previously, probably a more modest affair, which then, that is still one remnant surviving, and then the bigger, taller tower is from the period of the 1340s onwards. And then you can see what it looks like in winter on the bottom right, with the same view, of course. And in winter, as I say, the temperatures are very extreme in Prague. It has a Central European climate, which means that you get, in fact, you can get very hot, steamy, humid days in summer with temperatures up to about 35. And in winter, you can get them down to minus 20. So it's... You've got to be quite tough to be a citizen of Prague. Nothing like the clement climate of Cape Town. Right, so obviously we could spend a whole lecture, which I cannot do, on the statues of the Charles Bridge, but the bridge is built from the 1340s and would have been completed by the end of the 1300s. But the statues date from the Counter-Revolution, the great Counter-Reformation, I beg your pardon, the Counter-Reformation where the Catholic Church is fighting back against the rise of Protestantism, and it is fighting back in Prague in the early 18th century. So it is then, only then, that they begin to place these statues on the bridge. So the statues are a good 300 years later than the bridge itself. They're by various men, but the two great men are Brockhoff and Braun. They're both of German origin, and they are brilliant sculptors. They know incredibly how to sculpt the sense of movement, the sense of sort of bodily form in these statues. And one of them is St. Leitgard. You can see there. You can see the illustration on the left-hand side, which is a 1900 watercolor, and then you can see the statue itself in detail on the right. Again, you can see the figure of St. Leitgard. St. Leitgard was a German saint who supposedly had a vision where she supported Christ on the cross, and you can see her there. She's sort of moving towards Christ, but you can see her bodily form. You can see the amazing sense of her costume and so on, which is an example of the talent and the genius of Braun. And there are 30 in all of these statues. Now, because through the centuries they're carved of limestone, they are therefore susceptible to pollution, and the communists I think probably almost intentionally, but I don't know quite whether it was that. But anyway, they created a huge steel factory within the spitting distance of Prague in the 1950s, and all this smoke and pollution infected the statues, as it has been over the centuries. And now what they're doing, and they still are doing it as we speak, is to actually place copies of the statues in the original position on the bridge, and the original statue is placed in a museum which is called the Lapidarium, which again is on the perimeter of the centre of Prague. You can get to the Lapidarium quite easily by a tram, but it is not in the centre, it's not within walking distance. So you can see some of the original statues, some of which in fact are very badly decayed, and others which still show the reality of the sculptor. And this is going on at the moment. There were 2 or 3 spaces on the bridge last year where they obviously were replacing the statues. There's the Charles Bridge in various seasons and various times. You can see the top left are the Nazis going across the bridge, where actually you can make out the tram lines. A tram used to trundle across it at one stage, and it continued to be a bridge which had vehicles on it right up until the 1950s, when they finally did stop it. Now it's pedestrian, and there you can see it in the mist on the top. And there are 2 slides taken in summer. Now at this point you've turned your back to the castle, and you're facing towards the old town. You're going across the bridge from the castle district, across through the lesser town, and now you're crossing the bridge towards the old town. And there you can see the steeples and spires in the distance, in all the illustrations. There's 3 anyway. The tower which completes the bridge on the Old Town end is the Old Town Bridge Tower, and it is again from the period of the construction of the bridge in the 1340s onwards. The tower, as you can see, is in need of a spit and polish, really, but they have cleaned up the statues in the middle. And the statues show the central statue is St. Vitus, and then there's Charles IV on the left, and his son, the dreary son, Wenceslas IV, on the right. So from there, you'll come through that arch, and then you'll walk across a road into the old town, which is largely pedestrian. And in the old town, which is fascinating, the streets are all lined with buildings that go back hundreds of years. And they're all just sort of still there. It's just quite miraculous. And the big street, which is, again, very, very, very crowded, is called Karlova. And that's just a sort of collage that I made for you, having taken some of the some of the house signs. Obviously, the central sign just below the word Karlova obviously would be called the House of the Blue Horse, etc. And obviously, the top left would have been some imperial or regal house, and the top right would have been a chemist with a snake. And so it goes on. But this is still, because all the houses survive through the centuries. They're now numbered, of course, but in the olden days, they weren't numbered. And so it has this incredible variety. And these shops, these house signs themselves would date from a variety of the centuries, going back from the sort of 14th century through to the 20th century. So you eventually enter into what is the old town square. And as I mentioned to you, this is a fisheye photograph, which I lifted from the internet. I didn't take it myself, which shows the incredible variety. Starting on the far left, you have the Jan Hus monument, which we'll see tomorrow, and Jan Hus monument is 20th century. Then the next is the Goltskinsky Palace. The Goltskinsky Palace is a famous example of the most exquisite 18th century Baroque. Then next to that is called the House of the Bell. House of the Bell is, in fact, a palace in which probably Charles IV was born. So it's from the 1300s. The Tin Church, the Church of Our Lady before Tin, is a wonderful fairy tale structure. We'll see it in detail in a moment, which again is the 1400s. So we're going from 20, 18, 13, 14, then the merchant houses, which are all sort of 16, 17, 1800. The Old Town Hall clock, which is again 1400 onwards. There's a park where the Old Town Hall was stood before its destruction. And then finally, St. Nicholas of the Old Town. Now, I've already mentioned St. Nicholas of the Lesser Town. St. Nicholas of the Old Town is equally important. It is by the same architect, and it's just to confuse the tourists, really. There are two very famous churches, both called St. Nicholas. So a bad move would be to say with your friends, if you're with a group of people, oh, I'll meet you for lunch, let's go to lunch, I'll meet you outside St. Nicholas, and it'll be, you know, you've got to have your wits about you. It's just to confuse these people, serves them right. But anyway, there we are. So you have this amazing variety. Now we look down from the Old Town Tower, Town Hall, to these buildings. There again, in the detail on the left, is the Goldskinski Palace. It was originally a noble palace. Now, in fact, it's a picture gallery, a commercial gallery. And next to that, which you'll see again in detail in a minute, is the, moving from left to right, with its sort of conical roof, is the House of the Bell, which is, as I say, 1300s. Then you'll see the merchant houses in front of the Tin Church. The Tin Church, which is the 1400s, 1500s. And then you can see this, the old town itself surrounding this. Now, at the stone bell, all houses, as I say, would have had this sort of designation, and the bell, you can see, is carved in stone from the actual wall surface. It would have quite evidently have been bigger, and it's got a fascinating story, this, because in fact it was covered by a later sort of facade of the early 19th century. And in the 1960s, now the 1960s was under deepest, darkest communism, but it shows that even then they were aware of the tourism, aware of the tourist dollar, and they were beginning to restore buildings. Very, very slowly and very sort of, but very, not in any great quantity, but they obviously were restoring buildings at the Old Town Square. And they discovered underneath the facade, which had been placed there later, they discovered what is quite evidently now a unique example in the world of what in fact originally was a medieval royal palace. And it survives intact. It would have been much bigger. You can imagine, if you look at the doorway, that it would have been extended left to have another doorway and further windows again extending west to the left. So it would have been slightly bigger, probably double the size of what it is now. Today, rather in a mundane fashion, it's a DVD shop at the bottom. But I don't know what goes on up above. But it is a very, very important building. And it's thought that it was built originally for John of Luxembourg, who's the father of Charles IV. And it is probably where Charles IV was born. So again, it's pretty exciting. So then you can see the Tin Church again in the distance with its fairy tale steeples. And then the astronomical clock, which is placed on the facade of the Old Town Hall Tower. The clock inevitably has a Swiss mechanism, and it dates from the 1400s onwards, and it's not unique. I'm sure many of you have been to Munich, many of you have been to Bern in Switzerland, and many other cities as well, where they do have these wonderful mechanical clocks. But the upper level is the part that all sort of, it's all bells and whistles, it all works, the upper level. The lower level, which I show you a detail of on the far left, bottom left, is the figures don't work, they don't move, but it's the signs of the zodiac, obviously. But the upper level, they do move. There's the sun and the movement of the sun and the moon around the earth, the earth and the moon moving around the sun. And there are these figures. On the left-hand side, there's vanity admiring himself in a mirror. There's a miser holding the money bags. There's a skeleton ringing the bell for all of us eventually to succumb to. And there is a Turk shaking his head, and he's got a little mandolin in his arm. Now, on the hour, and you can see how it works in the tower itself, these figures, which don't have legs or anything, these figures move past the windows. They're the 12 apostles, and they all bow at the window. They bow to you as they go by. And when they've all done that, the cock at the top crows. So I've got a very bad record, very noisy recording of what it's all about. I think we're all children at heart. It's rather fun to see. And on the hour now, it's a huge attraction. Absolutely huge attraction. Anyway, you can see from the top left-hand photograph that the town hall was a much bigger structure before the Second World War. And as I mentioned earlier, as we all know, Prague wasn't badly damaged in the war, but simply because, obviously, Prague succumbed to the Nazi invasion in 1938. So they were already part of the Reich before the war started. And then they was brutally suppressed, as we saw yesterday, during the Nazi era. But there was a resistance, of course, as we saw. But the resistance was, again, completely shattered after 1942 when with the assassination of Heydrich. But there was an uprising towards the end of the war when the Russians were coming from the east and the Germans knew they were sort of on their last legs. They were retreating, and at that stage they did certain acts against the retreating Nazis. At which stage they blew up the town hall, part of the town hall. So you can see that the structure as it's seen in the 1930s then was a ruined shell after the uprising of 1945. And it was a warning that if you did any more damage to us as we retreat, if you do attack us further, then we'll blow up more things. And I think the decision quite sensibly was taken that they were going to be defeated anyway, so why not just let the dust settle and keep Prague in its state as it was. So you can see that both photographs at the lower level show the town hall as it was after the Nazi destruction. They decided then, and the coloured photograph above, the top right, shows that they rebuilt one bay, the single bay, the far left-hand bay adjacent to the tower. They left the rest. And it's now a park, which was a very sensible idea, I think. It's just a reminder that this was the act of war, etc., etc. The park, though, today is a rather fetid environment. It sells hamburgers and hot dogs and things. But it's all part of capitalism. Yay. So here, now we're long after Charles IV, of course, but this is one of the earliest identifiable and historic illustrations of what Prague looked like in a very stylized form. But it comes from what is called the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is it was a book of the illustrations of towns in Europe, including Nuremberg, of course. And there you can see Prague. And the colored illustration is exactly the same as the black and white below. You can see the castle, you can see the cathedral, or you can see the bell tower, you can see the east end of the cathedral. You can see the castle district as it was then. The lesser town below the castle district was obviously then partly fields. There's the Charles Bridge running across to what is the old town. And then in the front, bottom right, is the new town. So those are the various districts of Prague. And it is Charles IV again who constructs the new town. And again, it was an extraordinary piece of town. Bearing in mind it's 1300s. It's an extraordinarily advanced idea to actually to construct a planned new environment, a new city environment, a new urban environment. It was something that we associate with the Romans, and then, of course, all that died out, showing that this Charles was an incredibly far-sighted and also incredibly erudite man to actually have this desire to build a planned city environment, which, of course, the Middle Ages was totally the opposite, with all their winding little alleyways and so on. So you can see there what the central square, with the Charles Square, which is in fact a name which was given to the square much later, because originally it was called the Cattle Market. But you can see it's a big open space in the middle there, with, on the left-hand side, you can see the town hall, which has had various facelifts, but it's still the same building. And on the center of the Charles Square is the St. Ignatius Loyola, one of this multiplicity of Baroque churches in Prague. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of them, equally interesting and equally fascinating. And there's the St. Ignatius Loyola. And the Charles Square survives here. You can see what it looks like today at the bottom left. You can see that this is an illustration taken in winter, but you can see it's tree covered. It's rather lovely sort of urban space now, no longer a cattle market. And it is part of what there in the black letters is the Nove Mesto, which is the new town. There is Hradčany, which is the old town. There is the lesser town, Malá Strana. There's the lesser town, there's the old town. And then on the river itself, on the Vltava, was originally the Jewish quarter, which was once a walled quarter, and it's Josefov. The Jews in Prague settled there from its very earliest origins. There were various pogroms which took place over the centuries, but they have had, over the centuries, enormous periods of prosperity and liberality, particularly, not so much under Charles IV, but particularly under Rudolf II in the late 1500s. And we shall discuss that now. The Jewish quarter of Prague, the buildings, the civic buildings of the Jewish quarter survive through the centuries. And it's one of the most terrifying, ghastly things to think about, but the Nazis intended to keep the Jewish quarter as it was when they invaded the Czechoslovakia in 1938. They didn't destroy the synagogues as they did most other cities. They kept everything as it was. And the original surviving structures going back centuries are either the town hall, which you can see with the clock tower, or this very famous synagogue, the Old New Synagogue. But the other buildings of the Jewish quarter by the 1930s were modern. They were 19th century. But they all survived. They all kept it as it was, because what they intended to do was, when they destroyed synagogues in Lithuania or in Poland or wherever, they brought the treasures. They brought the candlesticks, they brought the Torah, they brought all the other treasures from these synagogues to make this a museum for the world then, when they had conquered the world, to see what these people were, this civilization which they had actually destroyed. It's the most extraordinary idea. So these buildings survive. The reason that's why they survive. And the Old New Synagogue is the oldest in Europe. There were earlier synagogues, but it's the only surviving one now. And it still today is a functioning synagogue. And you can see that it is exactly the same in the black and white photograph that is obviously taken in the late 1890s, 1900s. And you can see the Jewish town hall and the synagogue exactly as they were then and now. Just a bit of paint and titivate it up a bit. And the period which was so important for the Jewish community was during the era of Rudolf II. We shall discuss him tomorrow. He's a rather fascinating, rather very strange man, but a rather fascinating man, and a very, very liberal man. bearing in mind that the big threat and the big war was between the Protestants and the Catholics, Rudolf again gave them tolerance. Each of them were entitled to worship as they wished, and equally so he gave the tolerance to the Jewish community as well. To the extent that eventually the famous figure from that period is Rabbi Lof. Rabbi Lof, who was the great leader of the Prague Jewish community, who was born, in fact, in Poland, as you can see in Poznan, but he then became a rabbi in Moravia and eventually led the Jewish community, to the point where he was a great scholar, he was a great literary man, he was a great writer, and to the extent that Rudolf actually gave him an audience, which is something that emperors just don't do to the common man. You know, unless you were noble or whatever, you never had the privilege of being entertained by the emperor. And he dies in Prague and is buried in the old Jewish cemetery. This statue of him is, I think, fascinating. It's by this rather strange Czech sculptor called Shalun, who was also Jewish, but that's actually not the point. But Shalun is a very fascinating sculptor. I think we'll see his work again tomorrow. And this huge figure is rising upwards. And you can see from the detail on the bottom, you can see that he's holding up his hand. Because, in fact, what's happening is this great rabbi of enormous distinction and veneration has a nude girl sort of attached to him. And she's holding in her hand a poisoned rose, all very symbolic. In other words, it's a temptation, and he's saying no to her, and so on. But it's a rather strange idea. I don't know if I'd have chosen it myself, but still. Anyway, I think it's a rather fascinating statue, which is in the Jewish quarter, in part of what is the new town hall, and it's of Rabbi Lof. Now, the old Jewish cemetery is, again, very romantic to look at, and is in its present form since the 18th century. It hasn't been used as a burial ground since the late 18th century. So these tombstones today, all in this wonderful higgledy-piggledy manner, have been a wonderful source of information to scholars in the last 30, 40 years or more, and they've all been identified, of course, and it gives one a very clear idea of what the Jewish community consisted of through the centuries. It goes down, it would have gone down layer upon layer. There would be further tombs below this, buried on top of each other. It's quite small. And in the cemetery, of course, is the tomb of Rabbi Lof, who was a leader, the Baharal of Prague. And you can see there the little stones placed by the worshippers on his tombstone. Rabbi Lof, which is the Lion of Judah, and Judah Lof, the Lion of Judah. And the lion, therefore, in the center, which is the detail, is referring to his name, but also it refers to the Lion of Bohemia, so it's got this double meaning. Now, I've told you that the citizens of Prague, the Czechs in general, love legends, they love fairy tales, they love stories, and there is this famous story associated with Rabbi Lof. And this is Rabbi Lof, who supposedly created the golem. This goes back in all civilizations and all cultures, that we have, the Frankenstein monster. We all have these sort of strange ideas and concepts. So it's not totally unique. But, and nowadays, I'm afraid, it's almost entirely certain with scholars researching this, that in fact, it's all a complete invention of the 19th century. It doesn't go further back. The first reference to golem in Prague was in the early 19th century. But the theory was that Rabbi Roth, because of his great expertise, because of his great learning, because of his great devotion, created this figure out of clay, which he took from the Vltava River, and he created this huge structure so that when he made it work, when he made it human, or anthropological, he could then, the golem would then right the wrongs which were imposed upon the Jews and protect them. And then, in fact, what happens is that he does this, and he does this by placing in its mouth, in the golem's mouth, he places this Shem, these holy letters, in the mouth of the golem, and then the golem works, and then goes off fighting and protects them. And then if you take the Shem out, then the golem stops. Anyway, this didn't work one day, and he actually went in berserk on the Sabbath, for which he obviously had to suffer for this, and the rabbi supposedly shrunk the golem into a tiny little doll-like form and hid it in the loft of the old new synagogue. And that is still believed today by certain people. In fact, the Nazis believed in it. They went actually to ransack the synagogue to try and find the golem. So there are lots and lots of stories associated. And of course, today it's a huge tourist attraction. There's a golem restaurant, there's the golem postcards, and everything else associated. And they had an exhibition associated with the story in 2009. And that's the poster. The sketch on the left is by, again, Aleš, this very significant Czech artist of the 19th century. So we've sort of come to the end of the morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to do is play you the hymn from the service in the synagogue, which is called Art Nouveau, and you can see the Hebrew script, you can see the transliteration, and then the English translation. Oh, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And so it goes on. The recording is by a man called Lewandowski, who is actually Polish, and it is recorded in the University of Illinois.